Daphne had always believed that love revealed itself most clearly not in grand declarations, but in the quiet moments when certainty should have been effortless. It was in the pauses between Carter's words, in the way his gaze sometimes drifted away as if following a memory she could not see, that her unease began to take shape. At first, she dismissed it as pre-wedding anxiety, the natural turbulence that came before a lifelong commitment. Yet the longer she sat with the feeling, the more it hardened into something unmistakable. Carter was present in body, attentive in habit, and even affectionate in routine, but a part of him remained suspended elsewhere, tethered to a past he had never fully released. Daphne did not need anyone to say the name out loud for her to know who occupied that unreachable space. Hope existed between them like an unspoken truth, a shadow that lengthened the closer Daphne and Carter moved toward their future. The realization did not arrive as a single devastating moment, but as an accumulation of subtle fractures. Daphne noticed how Carter's voice softened when Hope's name surfaced in conversation, how his expressions carried a trace of nostalgia rather than neutrality. There were times when Daphne felt as though she was competing not with a person, but with a memory perfected by distance and regret. This awareness gnawed at her, not because she doubted her own worth, but because she understood what unresolved love could do to even the most well-intentioned heart. Carter was not cruel or deceptive in the traditional sense, his failing was far more dangerous. He wanted everything without choosing anything fully. As the wedding approached, Daphne attempted to confront the unease through conversation, believing that honesty could still salvage clarity. Yet each discussion with Carter seemed to circle the same unresolved center. He reassured her with words that sounded sincere but lacked the decisiveness she needed. He spoke of commitment as an intention rather than a fact, of love as something evolving rather than anchored. Daphne listened carefully, searching for reassurance that went beyond comfort and habit, but what she heard instead was hesitation disguised as thoughtfulness. Carter did not deny his feelings for Daphne, but neither did he extinguish the lingering presence of hope. His inability to draw a firm boundary around the past transformed every conversation into a silent standoff, where Daphne felt herself asking for certainty while Carter offered only patience. These conversations grew heavier, their emotional weight pressing down on Daphne with increasing urgency. What unsettled her most was not Carter's admission of complexity, but his reluctance to acknowledge its consequences. He spoke as though love could be layered without conflict, as though old feelings could exist harmlessly alongside new promises. Daphne, however, understood that marriage did not allow for such abstractions. She knew that unresolved love was not passive. It shaped choices, eroded intimacy, and eventually demanded reckoning. Each time Carter deferred clarity, Daphne felt herself retreat inward, forced to confront a painful truth she had been trying to soften. She was standing at the threshold of a future that required certainty, while the man she was meant to build it with remained emotionally divided. The tension between them reached a point where silence became louder than confrontation. Daphne found herself measuring every interaction, wondering whether Carter's affection was rooted in love or in familiarity, whether his commitment was genuine or simply the path of least resistance. The fear that began to surface was not of losing Carter, but of losing herself by accepting less than she deserved. Daphne had always valued emotional integrity, and the idea of entering a marriage shadowed by doubt felt like a betrayal of her own principles. She realized that clarity, even when painful, was a form of self-respect she could no longer postpone. It was with this resolve that Daphne chose to confront Carter directly. Not in anger, but in unwavering honesty. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of weeks of silent endurance. She did not accuse him of wrongdoing or demand explanations he could not give. Instead, she articulated the absence she felt between them, the uncertainty that had seeped into every promise. Daphne expressed her disappointment not as a reactionary outburst, but as a carefully considered truth. She told him that love without clarity felt like standing on unstable ground, and that she could no longer ignore the imbalance in their emotional commitment. Carter listened, visibly affected, yet still caught in the same internal conflict that had defined their struggle. When he responded, his admission was raw in its honesty and devastating in its implications. He confessed that his feelings were indeed complicated, that no matter how deeply he cared for Daphne, he had never fully exorcised hope from his emotional landscape. He spoke of the past not as something alive, but as something unfinished, a chapter that continued to echo in moments of vulnerability. Carter did not frame this as longing or desire, but as an emotional residue he could not deny. In doing so, he inadvertently confirmed Daphne's greatest fear. Hearing Carter articulate what she had already sensed was both clarifying and crushing. Daphne understood then that love, no matter how sincere, could not survive without decisiveness. She recognized that Carter's honesty, while admirable, came too late to alter the reality between them. The problem was not that he felt conflicted, but that he was willing to bring that conflict into a marriage and ask her to accept it as part of their foundation. Daphne realized that to proceed would mean living in perpetual negotiation with a past she had no power to change. With a composure that surprised even herself, Daphne made her decision. She told Carter that she could not move forward with the engagement. Not because she doubted his character, but because she refused to build a future on uncertainty. Ending the engagement was not an act of punishment or revenge, it was an act of self-preservation. Daphne acknowledged the love they shared, but she also recognized its limitations. She chose clarity over comfort, dignity over denial, and in doing so, she closed a chapter that had once promised permanence. Carter accepted Daphne's decision with a mixture of regret and resignation. There was no argument left to make, no justification that could undo the damage of indecision. As Daphne walked away, Carter was left to confront the solitude he had long postponed. He realized that by refusing to fully let go of the past, he had forfeited the future that stood within his reach. The weight of that realization settled heavily, forcing him to acknowledge that emotional ambiguity, when left unresolved, inevitably leads to loss. News of the broken engagement spread quickly, as such events often do, transforming a private reckoning into a public narrative. Speculation followed, with whispers of old flames and potential new beginnings swirling around Carter. Some saw opportunity where others saw vulnerability, and the absence of Daphne's steady presence left a noticeable void. Carter found himself at the center of renewed attention, confronted by the very possibilities he had failed to resolve. Yet the most pressing question lingered unspoken, heavy with implication. Would Carter seek out Hope now that his engagement had ended? And if he did, what consequences would that choice carry for Hope's marriage to Liam? Carter's history with Hope had always been marked by intensity and unfinished emotion. And the dissolution of his engagement reopened doors that had long been considered closed. Whether driven by regret, longing, or a desperate need for resolution, Carter stood at another crossroads. One that threatened to disrupt not only his own life, but the fragile stability of others. In the end, Daphne's departure did not merely end a relationship. It exposed the cost of emotional indecision. Her choice served as a reminder that love demands not only feeling, but courage. The courage to choose, to let go, and to honor the boundaries that protect the heart. Carter was left to grapple with the aftermath of his hesitation, while the ripple effects of that moment continued to unfold, carrying with them the possibility of redemption or further destruction. Whether he would finally confront his past or allow it to claim yet another future remained an unanswered question, suspended in the tension between what had been lost and what might still be undone. After the engagement collapsed, Carter told himself that solitude would be temporary, that the ache he carried was the natural consequence of loss rather than a signal of something unfinished. Yet the silence that followed Daphne's departure did not calm him. It sharpened him. Without the structure of obligation, his thoughts wandered back to the one place he had never truly sealed off. Hope returned to his consciousness not as temptation, but as familiarity, a memory that felt safe precisely because it was unresolved. He did not seek her out immediately. What he sought instead was understanding, or perhaps absolution, and it was in that emotional gray space that the first boundaries quietly eroded. Hope, for her part, had been fighting a different battle, one less visible but no less consuming. Marriage to Liam had given her stability, but stability had slowly begun to feel like emotional stillness rather than fulfillment. She loved Liam, or at least she believed she did. But love had started to feel procedural, weighed down by repetition and expectation. When news of Carter's broken engagement reached her, it unsettled her in ways she was not prepared to confront. She told herself that her concern was innocent, rooted in empathy rather than desire. Yet beneath that rationalization lay something far more dangerous. The recognition that Carter represented a version of herself that had never been fully explored. A path not taken, a question unanswered. Their reconnection did not begin as an affair. It began as shared vulnerability. Carter and Hope crossed paths in moments that felt coincidental but carried the quiet pull of inevitability. Their conversations were cautious at first, framed as concern, as reflection, as mutual respect for the lives they were supposed to be living. But emotional honesty, once unleashed, rarely stays contained. Each exchange peeled back layers of restraint, revealing how deeply they had both underestimated the bond they shared. Carter spoke of regret without naming it, of confusion without assigning blame. Hope listened with an intensity that betrayed her own unrest, finding herself drawn not just to his words, but to the recognition she saw reflected back at her. What neither of them acknowledged aloud was the moral line they were approaching. Hope was married, and that fact hovered over every interaction like a warning neither of them wanted to read. Carter knew this, and yet he justified his presence in her life as unfinished business rather than betrayal in progress. Hope convinced herself that emotional connection did not equate to disloyalty, that she was entitled to clarity just as Carter was. In doing so, she ignored the subtle shift taking place. The way anticipation replaced caution. The way secrecy began to feel necessary rather than optional. The decision to meet privately was not sudden, but it was deliberate. Hope framed it as closure, a conversation meant to resolve lingering questions and restore balance. Carter accepted under the same pretense, both of them clinging to language that softened the truth. They chose a place removed from familiarity. Somewhere quiet, somewhere they believed would grant them anonymity. Yet secrecy has a way of intensifying emotion rather than containing it. The very act of hiding transformed their meeting into something charged, something intimate before either of them realized it. As they sat together, the weight of everything unspoken pressed in. Carter felt the pull he had never fully escaped, the clarity he had denied himself for too long. Hope felt the fracture in her marriage widen, not because Liam had failed her in any obvious way, but because she had stopped listening to her own dissatisfaction. Their proximity dissolved the careful distance they had maintained, and when that final boundary fell, it did so quietly, without drama, as if it had never truly existed at all. They did not see Liam. He had not intended to follow Hope. Suspicion had not driven him there, instinct had. A subtle shift in her behavior, an emotional absence he could not articulate, had lodged itself in his awareness. When he arrived and saw them together, the world seemed to recalibrate around the image before him. Hope's body language told a story her words never could. Carter's presence alone would have been unsettling, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. Liam did not interrupt them immediately. Shock held him in place, forcing him to absorb the truth in fragments rather than all at once. The betrayal was not explosive, it was paralyzing. Liam felt something inside him collapse, not with rage but with devastating clarity. The woman he trusted, the marriage he believed in, the future he had been quietly protecting all unraveled in that moment. What cut deepest was not just the infidelity, but the recognition that this was not impulsive. This was emotional. This was chosen. Carter's history with Hope amplified the damage, turning the discovery into something far more personal than a momentary lapse. Hope saw Liam before he spoke, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. The secrecy she had justified collapsed instantly under the weight of consequence. Carter understood at the same time that whatever resolution he had been seeking had now transformed into irreversible harm. There was no narrative left that could soften what had been exposed. In that moment, Carter recognized the full cost of his indecision, not just to Daphne, but to everyone drawn into the gravitational pull of his unresolved past. Liam walked away without confrontation, without accusation. That silence was more devastating than anger could have been. It left Hope suspended in the aftermath of her own choices, forced to confront the reality she had been avoiding. She had not simply betrayed Liam, she had destabilized the foundation of her life. Carter, watching the fallout unfold, felt the weight of responsibility settle in with crushing inevitability. What he had mistaken for clarity was, in truth, another act of emotional recklessness. The consequences of that moment began to ripple outward almost immediately. Trust, once broken, did not fracture cleanly, it splintered, embedding itself into every corner of their lives. Hope was left questioning not just her marriage but her own moral compass. Carter stood at the center of the wreckage, forced to confront the reality that his inability to choose had once again destroyed something real. What remained uncertain was whether this revelation would lead to reckoning or repetition. Hope and Liam's marriage now hung in a fragile balance, threatened not just by betrayal, but by the deeper truth that Hope had been searching for something she could no longer deny. Carter faced a similar crossroads, one that demanded accountability rather than emotional escape. Whether any of them could rebuild what had been broken, or whether this moment marked the beginning of further unraveling, remained painfully unresolved. In the end, what had been exposed was not just an affair, but the danger of unfinished love. The kind that lingers quietly, reshaping decisions, blurring boundaries, and ultimately demanding its price. And as the silence settled in after discovery, one truth became unavoidable: some pasts, when left unresolved, do not stay buried. They return, not to heal, but to test how much destruction the heart is willing to endure before it finally chooses honesty.
Oh,